Hey friends, Billy Coppage. Just wanted to follow up. Last week, we started our REACH training, which is our biblical orality training. And we began by looking at the story of Elijah when he confronts Ahab and says, there will be no dew nor rain except at my word. And then God sends him away to the brook Cherith and hides him away and feeds him with ravens for some time. We did that story. We talked through it, and this is our follow up. We just Wednesday of last week we kind of went through it. I just want to provide a little recap. There may be others that are interested. Think of these more as like talking points. I'd like to just share the story one more time, just by way of refresher, or if you weren't there for the last session. And then I just would like to talk around some talking points. I wish we can kind of all sit in a circle, around a table and share a nice cup of coffee and kind of talk it through, because that's how it's meant to be done. So there's a limit to what we can do here, and there's things that I'm not going to be able to delve into in the way I would want to, or I'd want to ask and hear your perspective on. So there's a limit here, but I thought it might be helpful, or even just kind of fun to kind of say, okay, what can we discover, or what can we just kind of note that needs further exploration? This story. It's a true story, and it picks up right where last week's story ended. Where literally the scriptures tell us God tells us that the story tells us that the brook dried up. That's the end of last week's story. This story begins like this. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, saying, "Arise and go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, for I have commanded a widow to provide for you there." So Elijah arose and he went. And as he came to the gate of the city, behold, there was a woman who was picking up sticks. He called to her and said, "Please bring a little water in a jar that I may drink." And as she was going, he called and said, "Please also bring me a cake of bread in your hand." And the woman said, as surely as the Lord your God lives, I have no bread. There's only a handful of flour in the bowl and a little oil in the jar. And I'm collecting sticks that I may go in and prepare for me and my son, that we may eat and die. Elijah said to her, "Do not fear. Go, do as you have said. But first, make a cake of bread for me and bring it to me here. And then make one for you and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the bowl of flour will not be exhausted, nor will the jar of oil run dry until the Lord sends rain on the face of the earth." The woman went and did according to the word of Elijah. And she and Elijah and her household ate for many days. And the bowl of flour was not exhausted. And the jar of oil was not emptied, according to the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. That's the end of the story. Comes from 1 Kings 17, verses 8 to 16. And there's so many beautiful little parts to that story. And I wish we had more time. I'm intrigued that it starts out, "Then the word of the Lord came." I think in last week's story and in this week's story, 5 times we have references to God speaking. I think 4 times it says, "Thus saith the Lord," and 1 time it tells us this is what God's saying. So we got 5 references to God speaking. I think that's really significant. And particularly as we're talking about orality and doing oral Bible storytelling training, I think this is an incredible part of why the Elijah saga is so beautiful and so powerful, is because it just seeps with orality, this conversational intimacy between Elijah and God. So it opens up, the word comes to Elijah. Notice it comes to him only after the brook is dried up, the previous verse. So it's interesting. God gives instructions. The supply comes to an end. The brook is now dried. And only then does God give next instructions. Now, God's got choices. God could do it a different way. And yet God chooses to wait until the water runs out before he reveals the next step. I've provided for you in this way. And he didn't have to do it, but that's how he said, I've provided for you in this way. And then when that's completely empty, he says, and now, only now, will I reveal to you how I'm going to provide for you next. And it's interesting, the language in both this story and the one before, for I have commanded the ravens to provide for you, for I have commanded a widow to provide for you. On the one hand, you see God choosing to provide unusually, both the birds and now a widow. But then also God, there is a real sense in which his provision is intentional. It's like he's saying, don't worry. Dried up brooks don't scare me. I've already gotten to take you care of. All you have to do is get to Zarephath. Lord, could you pick somewhere closer? Zarephath, so we would have had to either walk through Ahab's country, that's Israel, or walk around Israel to avoid Ahab, who's now hunting for his head, to get to Zarephath, which is up in Sidon. So it's interesting, Elijah had to leave Israel for his own safety. That's been very relevant for our family. Some of you know our story. But it was like God was planning ahead, but planning ahead in a way he only revealed it at the last minute. I have commanded the ravens and the widow to provide for you. It's not that God doesn't have a plan. It's that the timing of when he reveals the plan looks very different. And certainly what I would expect, and I can imagine what Elijah would expect. It's interesting, he arises and goes, but you got to love the obedience. And in some ways you're kind of like, what else is he going to do? He's thirsty. Notice he gets to Zarephath and he's like, please, can I have some water? I wonder if there are some of us, I want to jump to application, forgive me. It's interesting though, I wonder if there are some of us who have just arrived in Zarephath and we're thirsty. We have stayed long at the brook Cherith Inn. And we're trusting God for his next provision, but we're thirsty. And we're showing up saying, please, just a small cup of water. And there he finds this woman collecting sticks so that she can feed her family their last meal, their last supper, and then they'll die. If you think the prophet is in a bad place, you get a woman and her family, if I can say it, in a worse place. And you can't help just wondering, what's going on here and what would be the emotional response of this woman? And the scripture doesn't make it completely clear. We can imagine shame, utter just desperation, just deep sadness, more than sadness, trauma, to be at the point of starvation. And not just her, but her family, her children. All that's going on. And just kind of the weight of that. I was not able to take care of my people. I wasn't enough to take care of my people. Elijah asks her for water and bread, which I can't help but wonder, if that's a soft allusion. Maybe not. But a soft allusion to God providing for the children of Israel in the wilderness. What did he provide? Water from the rock, manna from heaven. Elijah finds himself in a desert season, and God provides, but in a very unique sort of way. There seems to be a pattern of that. I think it's worth if nothing else, we can say that's a pattern. But notice her response. He says, bring me a cake of bread, and she says, I have no bread. And that stirred me, because it's like this is a woman that has reached the end of her resources. And I'm intrigued by that, because it's like she has come to the end and she has nowhere else to turn. I have no more bread. I have nothing. I have done everything I know to do. This is my last choice. She could not feed her son, and maybe she could eat his food or whatever's left. She could abandon her children or her son. She could try and run away. She could steal from the neighbors, or there are other choices, but in a practical sense, no, she's down to her last option. And you sense the desperation in her voice. I have no more bread. This is the person that God has sent the prophet to say, I'm going to take care of you through this desperate individual. God doesn't send the prophet to a wealthy woman. He sends a prophet to a desperate woman. So now you have two desperate people coming together. Two people in desperate situations entering into a shared desperation. You think, well, that's a recipe for disaster, for chaos. Plus God. Desperation, one, plus desperation, two. You would expect it to be multiplied desperation, except for God. And I love, we do get a glimpse of kind of her emotional response, what's going on, because what does Elijah say to her as he says, don't be afraid. Do not fear. It's like, are you serious? Like, fear is exactly the right response. But it's almost like it's just reassuring. Don't be afraid. Go and do what you said. I love that. It's like, oh yeah, carry on. Don't let me interrupt. Just make sure to bring me some and then take care of yourself. Notice there. You think, well, is this just a selfish prophet? Or is he actually inviting her, saying, is there an invitation to trust? And then he backs it up. He says, you're not trusting in me. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. This isn't one of the gods of Sidon or Zarephath. This is the God of Israel. What does he say? Notice his words. It's he who's speaking, the speaking theme. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the bowl of flour will not be exhausted, nor will the jar of oil run dry until he sends water on the face of the earth. Suddenly now he says, you're not to be afraid, not based on my word, not based on your circumstances. The invitation to not fear in the midst of desperation is based on what God said. And God said he would take care of you. And the shocking thing is the woman goes and does what the prophet said. And again, she had choices. She could have done it differently. She could have not. She could have just fed her baby and fallen over dead. But she risked. She risked in her desperation. Okay, I'm going to hold him to his word. And I love it because at the end of the day, it's a story about the faithfulness of God to his word, to his people in desperation. The bowl of flour did not run dry. Was not exhausted, and the jar of oil did not run dry. According to the word of the Lord spoken by the prophet. There it is again, one more time, just in case you missed it. Men and women, our time's quick, going quick. But I'm fascinated by the fact God doesn't reveal his instructions, his next plan of provision to Elijah until the brook dries up. Does that happen today? Do people experience that? You say, I am desperate. I only have this much money, this much time, this many contacts, this many relationships, this many days, this many years, this many months left. I need to know, how's God going to supply my need? God says, hold on. And is he inviting you into a place of quiet trust? To watch the brook dry up. I don't think he lightly assigns brook Cherith in stays. And maybe he's inviting you to trust him. Watch the brook dry up. That may be the hardest thing you ever have to do. Or one of the hardest things. But there may be parts of God that you learn in this season that you wouldn't know otherwise. I'm curious too by that, I have no more bread. I wonder if there are some here today who say, I have no more bread, Jesus. Billy, I've done everything I know to do. If that's right where God's saying, oh. So you're out of other options? Oh, good. Don't be afraid. Go and do as you had planned and let me supply. Is that what God's saying to us? To you, to me, today in some area, some relationship, some situation where the need feels much greater than the supply? Could it be that God's inviting us to trust, not in Elijah's word, not in Billy's word, but trust in his word in some new way. These are the conversations I like to have. I wish we could have more of them. Thank you for joining me.